Hello, and thank you all so much for making time. Good morning, or good afternoon, or good the middle of the night, whatever time it is for you right now. My name is Jessica Rose, and I'm exceptionally delighted that we're going to be welcoming Lola today. Lola is many, many things, but I've got a bad habit of trying to embarrass her by listing all of the fantastic things about her. And instead, I'm going to have her introduce herself just to sort of flip the script on that a bit. And she's going to be talking to us about web standards. For those of you who are part of the Free Web Development Bootcamp, we've talked about web compatibility and web standards a lot. So these shared rules, these agreements we have with how HTML is going to be shaped, how CSS is going to be shaped. But if you haven't been part of the bootcamp, I welcome you anyway. And we'll go ahead and explore this together. Lola, thank you so much for joining me.
Hi. Thank you for having me.
And we're going to do this in a really laid back way where folks can go ahead and ask any questions they might have during the stream.
Yeah,
Oh,
I'm
how
open to that.
stressful. I'll let you go ahead and introduce yourself and get started, and I will rudely butt in with people's questions as they arise.
Sure. So this is going to be just a really chill talk, just talking to you about web standards. First, a little bit about myself. My name is Lola Odelola, and I am a web developer advocate at the moment. In the past, I've been a web developer. I have been a technical support engineer and all sorts of other weird titles. And I currently work for Samsung Internet on their team. And I also do some work with the Open Web Docs, which is another organization that supports web documentation, open web documentation, as the name suggests. And I'm also the co-chair of the newly revived W3C Developer Council, which I will be talking a little bit about later in this chat. So yeah, that's me briefly. So to get straight into it, as Jess said, if you have any questions, please do feel free to ask during this. There's no limit, there's no real rules around that. You don't have to wait to the end. But I want to talk today about the W3C and its role in the wider internet community, web standards, what they are, how you can get involved, and what they do. So I did a boot camp similar to this, but it was in person, and it was 7 or 8 years ago now. That I'm not going to do the math on the spot. It was a while ago. And my background was in English literature and creative writing. So that's what my first degree is in. And I now use that degree in my everyday job, but at the time couldn't get a job as a writer. So I decided to go and do a boot camp. On my boot camp, there was no discussion about web standards. We didn't talk about it. I didn't know what it was. And it wasn't something that was on my radar until much later, further deep into my career. If any of you have used the Mozilla Developer Network MDN documentation to understand JavaScript or HTML, CSS, that work is actually very closely tied into web standards, because that documentation. Sorry, I've got my back door open, so I'm just going to close it.
Super chill. This gives me a chance to cheat and sneak in a question. Do you remember
Sure.
the first time? So I'm just so mean. Do you remember the first time you encountered standards? Did somebody just say web standards in passing and you had to go, wait, what?
No, I don't remember the first time, and I don't think it was that. I think before I knew what web standards were, I was introduced to W3C. So I was introduced to the W3C, and it was more kind of like, what is that? What do they do? And then I was like, oh, web standards. But then even then, I it was always very intimidating for me to get involved in, because the W3C notoriously isn't the easiest organization to navigate, even if you know where you're going. A classic thing for me is whenever I go on the website, I never know how to log in to get into the members area, because the login link is not prominent enough and it's really difficult to find for me. And that's me knowing that I'm going, knowing what I'm going there for, right?
Oh, I
So,
confess that now I'm looking for a login link. Oh no. Is it
right?
is it membership? No. Wait, no.
No,
I got it. I got it. I got it. It was in membership. Cool.
So yes, you see how notoriously difficult that was to find. But that just speaks to like a wider issue that they're trying to kind of curb with the developer council, which, as I said, I'll speak about a little later on. But essentially, I say that to say I wasn't taught about web standards when I was learning how to code, when I was doing that work at all. And so, fast forward 6 or 7 years, I get into this new job, which is Samsung Internet. This was my first official developer advocacy role. I had done developer advocacy in my like spare time for part of my organization, Black Girl Tech. A lot of my work there was developer advocacy and tech education and showing Black women and non-binary people what they can do with code, right? And so this was my first time I was getting actually paid to do this. And I remember the job description was like involvement in W3C preferable. And I was like, oh, well, that rules me out then because I'm like W3C is overwhelming. I don't know anything about W3C. What the hell is W3C? And I don't know if you remember this, Jess, but so like I came to you, I had applied, and then I came to you and I was like, oh, I see you know Ada Rose Cannon. Do you mind doing an intro? And you were like, oh, yeah, I do. But I also know Dan, who is now my manager. Do you want that intro instead? And I was like, yeah, sure. So I had that intro. And in that discussion, we did speak about web standards. And he was kind of like, oh, yeah, it's preferable, but it's not like by force we can introduce you. But sometimes they say that in interviews just to kind of like butter you up. So I wasn't sure. And then in my second interview, my now colleagues, but they weren't my colleagues at the time, they had said to me that getting involved in web standards is not like compulsory, right?
Okay.
So
So I might drag you all the way back just because the folks who are in this boot camp, they've got the worst teacher who's mean to them all the time. If you were trying to describe web standards to somebody who had never heard the very concept before.
Yeah, so I'm gonna so
I'm sorry. I do. Where I'm like, can you break it down in the simplest possible terms? You're like, literally in a minute.
Yeah, don't worry, we're gonna get to what, because when I was interviewing for this job, I still wasn't even at the level where I understood what web standards were, like really understood them. And so it was relieving to me to hear that I didn't have to touch web standards if I didn't want to touch web standards, right? And so then I get into the job, I get into the role, and everybody on the team is involved in web standards. So it's kind of like, it's going to look a bit weird if I'm not involved. And just to give you some context, my manager is part of the W3C technical architecture group, and they're kind of like the Illuminati of the W3C. They decide.
And we can quote you on this, yeah?
Don't tell Dan, but he is one of the co-chairs, and they essentially they don't decide, but they advise, and they say this is a good web standard, this is not a good web standard, and they have a criteria, and it's usually an ethical and technical criteria that each standard has to meet. So because I noticed all my colleagues are involved in web standards, I was like, okay, I need to really understand what this stuff is. You don't have to do this. I was not thrown into the deep end, but the way I began to understand it was just literally just getting stuck in it. And so I joined the community group, the privacy community group, and I was trying to understand it via that way. But essentially, web standards are a way of communicating how we use the web. And we have web standards for 3 main languages. So that's CSS, HTML standards, and JavaScript APIs.
Yeah.
Yeah, and it's not just the web in terms of like, how. So on one hand, it is like, okay, defining how a div works in a browser, right? Or defining how a CSS property works in a browser. So all browsers who want to adopt, for example, let's use the HTML tag H1. If you want to adopt H1 into your web browser, here is how you adopt it. And that's what each specification says. This is how it's supposed to work in a browser, and this is the behavior that is expected from this tag, the H1 tag. So if I create a browser and I want my browser to read HTML and I want my browser specifically to read the H1 tag, I need to follow this web standard, H1 web standard that has been defined by the writers in W3C. It's not just the web though. So it's not just HTML, CSS, and some JavaScript APIs. It's also how the browser works. It's also things like, if you press the back button, it needs to go to this location and not another location and stuff like that. So we're not talking, we have to be specific here because it doesn't cover mobile internet, mobile apps. It does cover mobile browsers, not mobile applications though.
So just to echo this back to you and see if I've got this okay.
Yeah.
The W3C is not a shadowy cabal, but not a shadowy cabal. And what they do is they write the specs or set sort of the classroom rules for the
Yes.
languages HTML, CSS, and JavaScript.
Yes, but when we talk about JavaScript, we're talking about JavaScript APIs
Just the
specifically.
APIs.
Yes, but to my understanding, somebody may come along and be like, "Oh no, she got it wrong." But like we're talking about JavaScript APIs. So an example of a JavaScript API, I'm trying to think of like a common one. This isn't a common one, but you may know of it. Is the WebRTC API, or WebXR, which is like the AR and XR stuff. WebXR, you can do, as I just mentioned, like augmented reality and stuff with JavaScript. That specific API is documented in W3C. The specification is written and it's offered as a proposal. If the proposal gets accepted, then it is a specification and it says how the WebXR JavaScript API should be used within browsers across, and it's not unique to like this is how it has to be used in Chrome, Firefox. It's across browsers. It's browser neutral. So yeah, that's kind of the idea behind it.
So they set the rules for HTML, CSS, JavaScript, just the APIs, not JavaScript, the language. That's chill. And then they also set rules that are shared between the makers of different browsers. Does that sound fair?
Yeah. Yeah. So like, just how browsers should interact and operate with the user. There are things that we as users, we expect that we don't even think about. We just expect, for example, when you scroll down, you expect the screen to go down. When you press up, you expect the screen to go up. Why are the rules limited to only
Yeah.
these three? That's
So
a really, really good
yeah.
question. Yeah, that's a really good
Tanya's
question.
asking, well, why isn't, and I'm just going to unzip this for you, Tanya. I'm always unfair to your very good questions. Why isn't the W3C in charge of Python?
That is a good question. Python isn't an in-browser language, similar to Ruby, similar to Java. These can run in their own. You can run a Ruby program or a Python program on your home server without the browser. JavaScript is an in-browser language similar to HTML, similar to CSS. Now, essentially they are just files. So you could, open an HTML file locally and it will spin up and you'll be able to see it, right? But there are languages that are like part of the browser and there are languages that are not. And a good way to know this is if you right click in any web page and you right click and you go to inspect element or you go to view source, you can see the languages that get compiled in the browser, and they are usually JavaScript, HTML, CSS. And you can play with JavaScript in the browser. You can play with HTML, CSS in the browser too, using this what you call it? It's not a tag.
Expect element
It's
or
inspect element option. Yeah,
yeah.
if you click that, you can play with these three languages, but you couldn't inspect element. Even if you have a Python app, you couldn't inspect element and play with Python in the browser. You would have to go to your server and play with that.
And Olgus really sums this back up and say, hey, it sounds like all of you are the bosses or the collective bosses or the the gatekeepers. Oh, it's a bit Ghostbusters. For just the webbiest of the languages. Anything your browser's in charge of, y'all help make the rules.
Yeah, so we're not the boss. We're not gatekeeper. We're trying not to be gatekeepers, right? We're trying to not do that. But we are the people, and when I say we, I'm including the people watching this too, because it is more of a, we're trying to be more of a democratic process, right? So it's more of a, we as the users of the web, the people that use the web, decide how the web should be used and defined. And you have representatives who do that. And you can get involved too. And so yeah, and how the web should be used, there are, as I mentioned before, there are ethical and technological requirements in how the web should be used as well. But keeping in mind the web is open, it's public, it's not a private, it's not privatized. And so with that in mind, ideally anyone should be able to give feedback, to ask questions, and to understand these
Yeah.
things as well, right? To give their own input.
That sounds really, really useful. And when we talk about sort of where standards boards sit, we had Bruce Lawson come to it and speak to us.
Mhm.
You know what? That was 100,000 years ago. And you're going to correct me if I'm wrong, I hope. He said that in the spec, the way that you're supposed to rank importance is
Mhm.
the users first, the folks who
Mhm.
consume the websites and the web first.
Yeah.
Then is it developers?
Mhm.
Then it's browser makers? Then
Yeah.
it's the board? I
So
probably
yeah,
forget like 3 people in there.
that sounds roughly about right. Because of the work I do is mainly about users and developers, that's kind of the lanes I stay in. And so that kind of brings us nicely into like the developer council actually. So
Yeah.
what we want to do, the developer council was alive before and it kind of fizzled out. And so we're trying to revive it. We're trying to like shoot some life back into it and really get people engaged with standards. What we're trying to do is operate as a like bi-directional port between the W3C and developers and the W3C. So we kind of sit somewhere in the middle. Um, Let me give a bit of context as well and just how the
Please.
W3C works. So there are different types of groups within the W3C. You have working groups, which you have to be a member of the W3C to partake in. And what being a member means is you pay a membership fee and then you can be involved in working groups. And within working groups, this is where the specifications and proposals for specifications are written, edited, and worked on, right? Then you have community groups. And I think there are like 40, let me check. I think there are like uh
I think we're both racing to check.
yeah,
I was
there
checking
are.
how much it costs to become a W3C member because
Oh, there is no fixed price. I believe
ooh.
it works on a scaling thing depending on how big your organization is and things like this. So it's going to cost differently for different people.
So this is more of an ask your boss kind of thing.
Yes, yes. Um, and so there are 35 working groups. And then you have community groups. And a community group is basically, you don't have to be a member to be a part of. Anybody can be a part of a community group. So, for example, I'm part of the privacy community group. And the kind of things that get discussed in a community group is the figuring out if people want a specification, figuring out, what questions and people have about a specification before it becomes a proposal, and things like this. So the community groups is a place to like, and each community group is going to have different objectives, but it's a place to really be rigorous in terms of the specs. So for example, let's say I have a idea for a specification, and this specification is to make sure that when somebody gives a browser camera access, that the camera doesn't immediately turn on. That there has to be a button that says, I want the camera on, right? Every time,
Yeah.
right? I go to I either create a community group or I go to a relevant community group and I say, this is my spec. Developers who are interested in that will come and ask me technical questions. We'll look at issues that may arise. We'll look at feedback and, also accessibility, all sorts of things. So an example is in the privacy community group I'm a part of, Google are proposing this thing called first party sets, which is a different way of doing cookies. This is something that's very controversial. And so it has been getting a lot of feedback within the community group. And I mean a lot, questions, feedback, concerns, and really trying to iron out how this is going to work, how this is going to be good for the web, etc. Another example is Apple want to do this thing called private click measurement, which is a way of collecting literally click measurements without collecting user data. So keeping user data anonymous. Again, it's a highly technical thing though. And so there's a lot of rigorous feedback and rigorous questioning and concerns from people across the web. As I said, you don't have to be a member. So anyone can come in and ask questions and get feedback. And give feedback and raise concerns. So like a concern of the privacy click measurements from Apple is this going to encourage fraud, click fraud? And so Apple now have to think about how they're going to prevent click fraud in this thing and come back to us and be like, these are the things we're thinking about. What do you think? And it's a more of a discussion in a community group in that sense.
So I'm consistently mean to you, and you're just consistently gracious about it. But I'm going to come back and ask if we can define a couple of terms, and
Sure.
then one thing I'd love to do is sort of come all the way back around, and say hypothetically, if I was a privacy weirdo, hypothetically, talk about how one could get involved in these community groups. So first, just in case I'm overly familiar with folks, just in case our beloved audience hasn't heard, what is very exciting.
Sorry.
No, it's great. I was like, what is a standard? And all of a sudden I get like this loud motorcycle in the background. I'm like, well, first off, standards, obviously cool. What is a web standard when we talk about standards?
Yeah, so how can I explain this in a good way? A web standard is
Yeah. Oh, sorry.
gonna,
I meant to ask about spec. Sorry.
yeah,
I'm rubbing because like when we talked about web standards, that this felt like these are the carefully researched shared rules
yes.
that have
So
been
the
approved.
standard is a standard is the approved rule. A specification is basically similar in that sense. I guess you can kind of use them interchangeably. A specification is like if you go to, I'm trying to see if I have an example of a spec here, but a
Ooh,
specification is
ooh,
the document that explains it all.
cool.
And it'll have the like headers, all of this. A proposal is before it becomes an official specification, you have to propose it to the technical architecture group and to other groups as well to say, can we do this? Is this feasible within W3C? La, 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 la. So the proposal is like the asking permission of the spec, if the spec can be approved. And then you have the specification, which then defines some standards within it.
Cool.
If that
So,
makes sense.
hey, I have an idea. Proposal gets discussed, and I'm guessing everybody's real polite, but are they like real polite arguments?
Mm.
Look how gracious you are. You're like, yeah, maybe.
Yeah,
So
especially
okay.
for the more controversial things, I would
Oh
say.
yeah, let's get there. So hypothetically, I'm a
Hmm.
privacy weirdo.
Hmm.
Very hypothetical. And I want to be involved in this polite argument.
Hmm.
Where do I show up? Is there just like a line for polite arguments? And
And so
this
that's
makes a really good point. Do I need to demonstrate that I've got a specific type of no, I could just show up and get loud.
absolutely, absolutely not. So you've got two questions there. One question is how do you get involved, and the other question is do you need like a special
Yeah.
skill or technical ability? The first question, how do you get involved? That's kind of where the developer council fits in, right? So ideally, you would come to us and be like, you want to get involved in this thing, you're not too sure where to go, and then we can point you in the right direction. And don't worry, I will let you know how you can get involved in the developer
That's
council.
exactly where I was going with that. I'm rubbish, where I'm like, wait,
Slack,
but,
yeah, Slack, GitHub, mailing list, all of that
and we'll
stuff.
throw all of those in the chat. It's super chill.
Yeah. And then also you can also, if you know the group that you want to join, you can probably find out the URL. It's usually if it's a community group, it will probably be w3c.org/community/the group name. But that's like a throwing a dart at the dartboard and hoping for the best, so that might not necessarily be it. I will try and find the directory. I believe there is a directory, but again, it's not the easiest thing to find. But yeah, so that's how, if you wanted to get involved, you would find the group you want to get involved in and then join. Now, it's different if you wanted to join a working group. So that's if you want to join a community group. If you want to join a working group, first thing, your organization needs to be a member of the W3C. Individuals typically aren't members by themselves. Like typically it's companies who are members of the W3C, and then they nominate representatives who will represent them in various working groups. So I would just use my situation as an example. Samsung is a member of the W3C. Samsung then nominates me to be part of whatever groups they see fit or whatever groups I want to be a part of. So my colleague is the co-chair of the WebXR working group. So Samsung nominates her to be in the WebXR working group, and then they can contribute within that working group. How working groups work is slightly different to how community groups work, because at that point, the specification is being worked on, like for real, and it's being edited. And so you're going through a lot more fine tuning technical details and things like that. In terms of, let me just answer
No,
the
it's
other
fine.
question. In terms of, do you need a special skill or knowledge? No, and just, yeah, no. I didn't know, when I say I didn't know that much about privacy, I didn't know a lot of technical stuff about privacy, right? I knew the things like, using a VPN for certain things. I knew about protecting your data in certain capacities and things like that. But I don't know about ciphers. I don't know about cybersecurity. I don't know about cryptography, none of that stuff. So sometimes the conversations do go over my head. The good thing about the meetings, though, is that they do keep minutes. So going back and reading over the minutes and, Googling things I don't understand. And hopefully you're in a really friendly and open group, but asking questions is welcome. It's what they want. You can ask a question and be like, oh, I don't quite understand that. What is that? Especially in a community group, because you're not even just getting developers. You may be getting advocates, activists. You may be getting people who don't code at all. You may just be getting people who are going to use the tech, but not necessarily build with the tech. And so asking questions is totally fine and welcome. And yeah, you definitely don't need to be like, 10 years of experience just to comment.
So I just wanted to sort of echo this back to you to make sure I understand,
Mm-hmm,
because I usually don't. So on the
mm-hmm,
community group side, you can. So I found W3 org/community/groups seem to have both the working groups and community groups. So if I'm
mm-hmm,
interested in a community group, I
mm-hmm,
can just start reading the minutes.
mm-hmm,
I'm going to get some information from you about how I can come bother the developer council about learning more.
mm-hmm,
And I can get involved in the conversations there. But if I want to be in the working group, and the big
mm.
difference there is the community group seems to discuss more things, take wider input, whereas the working groups are, we're going to sit down and type this up and do like we're going to do the work.
The work, yeah.
And the way I get on one of those is I work someplace where my boss sends me to do the work.
Essentially. So yeah, like your boss, your company has to just be a member. And some companies, see it as a good thing because you get to be part of the decision making process about these key technologies. But some companies are not involved at all in W3C. So it really depends on the priorities of your company.
Gosh, it sounds like working at Samsung would be the perfect next step for somebody who really wants to be involved. Hands-on. Sorry, that's the closest I'll get to a plug. Actually, no, I don't work for Samsung, but I'm going to make your boss buy me like a fancy cake for having said that on the air. Just to remind all of you that as an educator, it's very important that you remain impartial and available to bribe for pastries.
Of course, that's the most important thing.
So, what kind? You know what? I'm going to let you keep chatting because a lot of the questions you said, "Oh, we're going to get to that in a minute." I'm like, but now, so I'm going to mute myself and give you some space.
Sure. So in terms of the developer council, then we kind of, oh, sorry, before I get to that, there was one more kind of group that I didn't really speak about, which is the advisory groups within the W3C. Not anyone can join this, even if your company is a member. You have to be nominated to be part of an advisory group. And so
What?
there are two advisory groups. I can't remember the name of the second one, but the first one is the technical architecture group, which is the group that I spoke about earlier. And they basically say yes or no to certain proposals, and they usually have representatives from a few different companies. So they might have someone from Google, Firefox, Samsung, Apple, just a few different places. So it's not biased necessarily, and it's usually people who are working with browsers, so they understand what their browsers need, and things like this. And then the other group, so they're more technical. And then the other advisory group is more like business related, finances, and things like of that nature. So the Dev Council kind of sits in between a community group and an advisory group. A community group in the sense anybody can be a part of us. Anyone can come to us and ask questions and get involved. And an advisory group in the sense of the work we want to do with the W3C is actually spec writers and editors and proposers can come to us and be like, okay, I want to create CSS4. What do the developer community think about CSS4? Do they want it? And then we can go to the developer community and be like, hey, what do you think about CSS4? Do you want it? And then the developer community can come to us and be like, we don't know. We want to ask more questions. And then we can hold a meeting and be like, okay, spec writers come to this meeting, show the developer community CSS4. Developers who are interested, come and hear about CSS4 and really interrogate it, ask your questions. And so we can kind of act as that kind of like advisory body in that sense, not necessarily in the sense of like, you're wrong, you're right, but just more facilitating the communication between developers who are not necessarily like deep involved in W3C and also spec writers who want more input, more feedback, more questions in terms of the spec that they want to write. I see a question here.
Which is really what you were answering at the time. And that's why I threw that up just to distract you. So August was saying, hey, how do you take ideas from the community? Like the themes that are discussed here, how do you get those ideas? And like, ta-da, through the developer working group, developer
council. Yeah. So like if you have an idea for a proposal, the first thing would be to see if someone's already working on that idea. You probably want to look for, and you can come to us to help with this, but you probably want to look for a working group or community group that's already discussing this. Or if they're not already discussing it, you can look for the appropriate community group first to see if it has been discussed in the past and what the issues were, if it didn't go through. And if it's not been discussed in the past, if people want to bring it up. And there are different ways you can do this. The two groups I'm a part of, we use GitHub to suggest agenda items. And so you can create an issue on the GitHub repo, on the relevant GitHub repo, and just tag it with agenda. And then it'll be discussed in the next meeting. Usually, you would want to have done a little bit of research first. So it's not just, oh, I
That's
want
so
to do CS.
gentle.
It's not just like I want to create CSS for what do people think. It's like, what specific thing do you want to build on? What technical research have you done into it? How feasible is it? In that regard, you usually don't want to just come with something like with just an idea. You want to come with something to test the waters that can be interrogated, and then go back and go forward and go back and go forward and go back and go forward.
So, just to use a more concrete example, and a concrete example which is a time tested bad idea. If I
Yeah.
came and I said, hey, I really want there to be a blink tag in HTML. And
Mm,
for folks who are in the boot camp, they've, oh, back in the dark, dim days, we used to have these blink tags and they took it away because we were bad.
yeah.
That would automatically, like, I haven't done my research.
Yeah.
I'm not aware that that used to exist. I'm not aware it got taken away from us because we didn't deserve it. And just and I imagine that's one of those things where every couple of years somebody proposes it like, "Hey, can we have it back?" So, like, there's probably doing the research a body of existing arguments around why you don't wanna hear about it ever again.
Yeah. And, a lot of this information isn't just stored within the W3C. Other people write about this stuff. So you're going to find, even if it's blog posts, people are very opinionated, whether for good or
How
for bad.
gentle! You're like, "Humans, also a mistake."
People have thoughts and they express them, and I will say this, I'm also very opinionated, so I include myself in people, but people are very opinionated, so you are going to find arguments for and against the thing that you may want to bring, if it's not new, if it's not completely new. You're going to find arguments for and against. Something else to consider too is that, for example, if you did want to bring back the blink tag, right, let's say it wasn't an evil thing and it was just something that was taken away by circumstance, and it's a good time to bring it back, you would want to see what the relevant group has on their plate at the moment, because
Yeah.
there's kind of like a queue of things, right? There are things that need to be done, and your thing may not be the thing of the most priority,
You
so
are so gentle.
you have to be mindful about, because we have to think of it. I don't like using the word community for things that are very business related, but you have to think of it as, being considerate about what's on other people's plates and on other people's time, because everybody who is part of a W3C working group also has a full-time job. W3C stuff is not their full-time job unless they are employed by the W3C. And the W3C only has 60 employees.
What?
But in comparison, it has 35 working groups, 300 community and business groups, and about 10 interest groups. So that's almost 400 different groups, and definitely thousands of different people being involved in these various groups and working on these things. So, and also doing their like day jobs, or the thing that brings them money, unless they're millionaires or whatever. So, you have to just be considerate about what else is going on, within certain groups as well, and understand that each group has a chair. So really and truly, it comes down to the chair to kind of navigate this stuff and prioritize these things anyway. But don't take it to heart if your thing is not the thing that gets priority immediately.
I
So
love
yeah.
both. Yeah. You know how every single specific warning label came from somebody doing something baffling? Every time you paused gently and politically, I'm like, "Cool, that was a separate internet argument, wasn't it?" Where you were like, "Yeah, people are really busy." And I especially love how that just spoke direct to me, where it's just like, "Jess, you are never getting the blink tag back. You really need to make your peace with it. It's not gonna happen, and nobody's gonna wanna hear about it." Because really, we should all be putting our energy behind Marquee, which was better anyway.
A better thing, right?
Oh, did
Yeah.
that you know what? I think the last time I used Marquee would have been right about the time you were born. I am
Okay, but people assume I'm younger than I am. So like I'm going to be 30. I'm 29.
I was like, what a fantastic humble brag where you were like, "Oh, you know what? I just look incredibly young. I'm the advantaged age of it." Where it was one of those things where I was like, "Wow, what a way to take a compliment." And then I'm dead now. I'm dead now. Where you're like, "I'm almost 30." I'm like, "Oh yeah, that's 30, 30. 30 is so
No, but like people
old."
think no, but people think I'm like 19, which is like 10 years off my age. So I have to, it's like I'm not old. I'm definitely not old, but like I'm also not that young.
Not a
Like I'm
baby.
not, yeah.
And as
I'm
somebody
firmly
who's
into adulthood.
Yeah. As somebody who's working on web standards, do you find that this is one of the positive side effects of web standards, that the jovial nature and the low stakes behind all of the arguments and the really peaceful tone helps keep you so young?
No, because that's, if I'm gonna be absolutely real, I'm just gonna be like completely real. Um, Depending on the group and depending how controversial the thing you're working on is, it's not going to be jovial and low stakes. um, for example, the first party set stuff that
Oh,
Google are working on, that's very controversial. And for very good reasons, there are a lot of people who oppose it. Um, and so, and that's also something that, starts to kind of redefine how people view their data and their privacy and all of this kind of stuff. And so that becomes a big deal, that, I mean, just today I saw tech lawyers arguing on Twitter about this. And so,
oh,
it's
lawyer
not,
arguments.
yeah.
Ooh,
And
ooh.
so things like that, and also, you don't want to see the GitHub repos and the back and forths on there and
I
things like, because all,
do. I do.
all of
So
it, all of it is public. And so anyone can see it and anyone can comment and get involved also, right? But it really does depend. And a lot of people do see the work they're doing as very important, especially, people who are working in the accessibility side of the standards body and stuff like that. So if anything, there may be days where you might need to like decompress after a meeting and just kind of like woosah and like meditate, maybe journal, go outside into nature, touch some grass, just to like, get all of that out. But it is still good work and it is still important work because we need, I think the good thing about, like, I don't see, and I'm picking on Google only because like this is something I'm not directly involved in, but this is something that I have
they're in
given
the
feedback
news this
on.
week. They're ready for it. They're fine. They're just everybody is just chilling these days. They're like, yeah, yeah, say privacy. Let's go. As long
But
as you don't say AMP, they'll be like, yeah, yeah, let's just go with that standards thing instead.
yeah. So yeah, like the kind of good thing though is that Google are participating in this, right? So they could equally just release this thing and that's it. But they are participating and they are hearing feedback, and hopefully they will listen to that feedback and work on that feedback. And in a sense, web standards, the W3C, because also another thing is we are not the only web standards, we are not the only standards body.
Yeah.
But the W3C acts kind of as a way to hold browsers accountable, people who work in browsers accountable to a certain set of standards, but not just technical standards, but also ethical standards as well. And so, one of the things that one of the ethical standards that the W3C have is that, whatever we create is not going to do, it's not going to harm the user. And then we also have ethical standards related to privacy and data and things like this too. And so we do the work that, and when I say we, I'm not even speaking about, I'm speaking about we,
Yeah.
anybody who wants to be a part of the W3C, whether it's a community group or working group. The work we do is about holding browsers and developers and whoever is using the web accountable into a certain level of behavior, not just doing things because you can, kind of thing. And that's where the controversy comes because, people want to do the things just
You
because
want to
they
do what
can.
you
And
want to
then
do. Yeah.
exactly. And so that's, yeah.
And like working with some of the boot campers, they're so much smarter than I'll ever be. Oh, and they're cool as well. It's absolutely disgusting. There's no reason to be both smart and cool. I mean, also my complaint with you. But every now and again, they'll ask me a fantastic question, which is
Hmm.
so heart-rendingly baffling that I had never put concepts. Somebody asked me, "Hey, what would I have to type to make a link that's completely invisible?" I said, "I'm sorry, you what?" So yeah, I want like a section of my website, like maybe part of the background to be a link, but I want it to be completely invisible. I'm like, no. Like, no, I think we're literally not allowed to do that for reasons. And they're like, well, who says I can't do it? I'm like, well, both me. But so I don't have to be the bad guy here. You know what? I think the W3C, like they must have had, and immediately somebody else came back to be like, no, figured out how to do it. Where I was like, that's technically correct. Don't do it. But like,
Yeah.
you all are absolutely correct. You have worked out how to make a completely invisible link. What?
Yeah. You
Um,
shouldn't. I just want to echo Jess there. Don't do that. Like that's like accessibility nightmare. That's,
we did that was before we did our accessibility sections. And now
I was,
everybody's like, oh, cool. That would be a jerk thing to do. Although
yeah.
you could make it invisible to all users except for screen reader users, couldn't you?
Yeah, but
It's so
even still, because like that's another thing. That's like a philosophical discussion about what users expect from the browser and why you would want to do that. Like, there's probably
yeah.
something a better way, which you probably have covered, as you mentioned. You've done the
Well,
accessibility
because
stuff,
Catherine
so
was like, what's the reason for that? And like, obviously, because it's cool. I confess that chaos might have been the reason to be like, oh yeah, ask anything. It's okay if you stop me. And they're like,
yeah.
how would I do this baffling thing? I was like,
Why would you want to? But that's good. That's good. It
yeah, like
exercises like, yeah, exercises thought processes in the brain
I
and
love
make
that you
sure
had
you
the
know
immediate
stuff.
same response where I was like, don't do it. I'm like, yeah, no. And like,
You don't do that.
see, look, we're getting my boot campers who are like, but what for art?
Okay, this is, do you know what? I really love that question for art because I consider myself an artist. Like, my background's in writing and I'm super into like creative stuff too. But there are so many things that even web designers do for artistic purposes that are just not correct. They're not right. You have to always think about your users in mind. And if the art that you are creating on the web is such that it's going to be either harmful to a set of users or is going to inhibit how certain users use your art or interact with your art, then that's not good. Like, you want your users to interact properly with the art. If you have an invisible link, I'm assuming a link that can't be seen, but it's still a
Yeah,
link.
yeah,
Yeah, that's gonna disrupt not even just people with accessibility issues, but just your regular users. When a user sees a link or when a user clicks on something, they expect certain behavior. And so if you are not doing that certain behavior, that's your users aren't going to
yeah.
appreciate that.
So
But yeah, that's another.
I'm going to make a large prescription that's going to sound like I'm stepping out of my bounds. So when we're talking about art on the web, really you're
Mhm,
limited by two things, we're going to say. And the limitations on here are your imagination, that you can get
mhm,
as weird as you want within the limits of your imagination, but also sort of the most core best practices around the ability to access things in expected behavior. You can get as unexpected as you want it with art, but
mhm.
not trapping someone on a website. I was about to ask you a specific standards question to say, are we not supposed to autoplay music anymore?
So I don't know. So like, I think
I like the way
Mage
like
Store
Mad Store said, and
SF.
do you know what? I will go and get Antonio back again because I bet you money that Antonio is still going to be like, no, Lola's right. Like, you need to follow the. What's he doing right
Like,
now?
I think so. Like, if the point is to disrupt, that is slightly different, but you need to, and this is not just in art, this is in everything you do technically. You need to be able to justify your technical decisions, right? And
Oh,
I'm sure that this is something that
ooh,
you've covered or will cover, but when you're working on a team, in a company, and you are all building, you're all contributing to one product, and say you want to build a feature, but you want to build it. Person A wants to build a feature this way. Person B wants to build a feature this way. Both ways are correct, right? So it comes down to being able to justify why the feature should be built, whichever way it ends up being built, whether that's A or B. You always need to be able to justify the technical decisions that you make and show that you've thought about the consequences of this, consequences for the users and consequences, whether that's browsers and things like this. If you are making disruptive art on the web, it needs to be obviously so. So you cannot have a blog page, for instance, with invisible links and images, because if someone goes on there with the intention of reading a blog and now all these invisible links are taking them here, there, and everywhere and disrupting the reading experience, that's going to be annoying. That's not going to have and even if it's not going to have the thought experiment effects that you want, it's just going to piss your users off and they're going to press X and they're not going to be users anymore, right? But if they are going into the situation expecting to be disrupted, that's completely different. And I know, for example, back in the day when I was like doing poetry stuff, I was part of an exhibit at the Barbican, and we had this
Wait,
tunnel.
what?
There's a tunnel. Yeah, this was like back in the day, but there was a tunnel in the Barbican and it was like super, super echoey, right? Super echoey. And it was like this whole audible experience. And I had to create a poem. We had to create poems basically that were read in this like sensory weirdness, right? The thing is, people knew they were stepping into sensory weirdness when they walked into it, and they made the decision to endure that sensory weirdness. It would be completely different if we turned the whole Barbican into that, so people couldn't consent to, enduring that sensory weirdness, right? So yeah, I
Yeah.
think it's different.
Cool.
You have to be mindful and thinking about how you are using the web in a way that is, the key thing here is not to be harmful to your users and
Yeah.
not to like piss them off, basically.
So we've got a question from Catherine, and I might gently suggest this one might be out of scope to say, oh, could you do weird stuff with undercover activism and government sabotage? I might go ahead and suggest that an invisible link is going to mess with your day-to-day users. We're still stuck on this invisible link example, but
Yeah,
like I don't think that's going to stop the government from coming to get you. Like if you're
it's
interested
not.
in, yeah, if you're interested in online activism and privacy, no, like definitely don't ask me. And this might, Lola maybe is a good resource. I'd probably send you to privacy focused. Well, let's get your name off the screen. I'd probably send you to privacy focused communities. So starting
Yeah.
with folks like the EFF, starting with tools
EFF,
like Signal for,
privacy,
yeah.
DuckDuckGo. DuckDuckGo have a really, really great resource of privacy stuff. And
Are
it's
they
got like,
involved in the privacy working group?
I believe they have a representative there. It changes every week. We have a meeting, but they are involved in W3C
Oh,
stuff.
good, good. I was about to say, I
Yeah.
was just like, I could only imagine them be like, oh, y'all want to what? Okay.
Yeah. And also the Brave browser as well have a bunch of like resources as well. But the EFF is great for that kind of stuff.
Just decided, and a lot of their advice is like, "Cool, don't." Which is
Yeah.
exactly what you want as an individual. Where you're like, "Hey, I want to do this thing," and they're like, "Yeah, no, no, no. Come back in 2 years."
Yeah, because and I think the invisible link, I know we're still kind of stuck on that, but I think that's a really good example because it kind of speaks to something broader too. And it's also something that the W3C and things we're trying to think about when we, create these things. Not every user is even gonna be in the West, for
Yeah,
example, right? If you have slower internet speeds, or even if you are in the West, slower internet speeds and all of these kind of things impact how your web page renders. And so if you have these weird things that do not work in the way they're supposed to work, even for the users that you want them to work for, it's just not going to be a good experience for the user, even if it is like good intentions behind
yeah.
them.
And I want to go ahead and get my learners off because it sounds like you're picking on just this one. I will say completely good bad idea, and really I blame me because consistently what I'm saying during our sessions is, hey, you can get as weird as you want. It's your website, and then having to backpedal and say, wait, there's an asterisk, but like within the bounds of shared basic best practices and
Yeah.
accessibility.
And I will say, like, the W3C specifications are difficult to read. That's largely because they're not written necessarily for developers. They are written for browser vendors, right? And so they are very technical. They're very like, I find it hard to read some of them. Um,
Oh,
however, However, MDN, as I mentioned earlier, MDN is a good partner documentation source to read because they document this stuff in real world, like how you can use it in the real world. And they also document how you should use it in the real world too. And the good thing about MDN is that um, for each API, whether that's HTML API, CSS, JavaScript stuff, they will have something at the bottom that shows you which browsers this thing is available in. So it's called the browser compact data right at the bottom, and it'll say, okay, It's not available in Internet Explorer, but it's available in Edge. It's available in Chrome. It's available in Opera, maybe, I don't know, and Samsung Internet and all these other mobile browsers too, right? And so MDN really is a easier to read version of some of the specifications, a lot of the specifications that are out from the W3C.
Yeah. And I'm really conscious that you're going to have to leave us in a second to go do much more incredibly important internet argument work. You know what? That's the way I'm gonna parse standards work from now on. If folks wanted to learn more about the developer,
Developer
not
Council.
I keep saying developer working group, and that's clearly not. I'm so. If people wanted to learn more about the developer council, where can they find them, and where can they find you online in a laid back, non-stalkery way?
Sure. So I just published a post on the Samsung Internet blog this today, and I'm gonna put it in here. Um, Let
Yeah.
me just get the link.
Oh, do you know what? I don't Are you able to just cross post them to both? That would be pretty cool.
Um, oh no, I have to send it to you.
Just send it to me. And do you know what this will make? Oh, yes, I had that at my fingertips. It's not that I had that
Great,
passed to me.
great. So this blog post actually has like a lot of more information about the developer council and also has the different places where you can join. So it's got the W3C page, the Slack, and the GitHub. What we use our GitHub for, basically, so tomorrow we have a meeting, and this will be the final meeting we have before we open up to completely everybody. We do have a leadership team, so I'm co-chair, Boaz Sender is another co-chair, and then we have 3 members of the leadership team, which are Olu, Debs, and Jackie Alsan. Yeah, Olu's part of it too. um,
Sorry. For those of you, Olu is based down in London, I think, and is one.
yeah.
I know I've just said this when you joined, but again, one of the smartest people I've ever met. I don't, there's smart people in Birmingham too, but lots of clever people down south at the moment.
And so we're going to basically put together our working statement, and you'll be able to see what we want to do over the next couple of years, and how we're going to go about doing that. And that's what you'll be able to see on our GitHub. You'll also be able to see agendas, minutes of meetings, things like that. You'll be able to ask questions and issues if you have any questions, and things like that. Agenda items for our next meeting. We have a meeting once a month, every fourth Thursday of the month. And so tomorrow will be October, and then November, etc. And so, yeah, everything is in that blog post. So have a read, share it if you enjoy it or if you think someone else will benefit from it too. And yeah, if there are any other questions, like, got like 1 minute or so.
I can also come and check. Well, people can come and well, not yell at you. People are
Oh
not
yeah.
allowed to yell at you. But people can come and find you on social media, can't they?
Yeah, so my at is at Lola, Odelola, and that's me on Twitter.
I
I
know for folks new to the boot camp, like, is a lot of Twitter, isn't it?
yeah.
It's because that's where we hang out when we're pretending we're working. Unlike for me, Lola is actually continually working on valuable things.
Uh,
Quite. Lola, thank you
yeah.
so much for your time. You are always so, so lovely to talk to, and I hope you have the easy
Thank
rest of your
you.
day. I can't wait to go
Thank
to
you.
GitHub myself and dig through past drama. Who doesn't like internet arguments? Thank you for telling us more about the W3C and how we can get involved ourselves.
Okay, great.
Bye.
Thank you very much.
Ah,
Bye.
bye, everybody.